The champagne flute in Wyatt Williamson's hand felt foreign, an unnecessary accessory in an evening already overflowing with excess. Standing at the edge of his cousin Mark's wedding reception, he surveyed the opulent ballroom with detached interest. Crystal chandeliers, white orchids cascading from gold-plated stands, and a string quartet playing softly in the corner, all perfectly arranged as befitted the union of two wealthy families. He'd contributed generously to the spectacle, of course. What else was a 32-year-old tech millionaire supposed to do with his money if not indulge his favorite cousin? "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," a voice said, breaking through his thoughts. Wyatt turned, prepared to offer some polite deflection, but the words died on his lips. Standing before him was a woman in a simple sage-green dress, her auburn hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. Unlike most of the guests who sparkled with diamonds and designer labels, she wore only a delicate gold pendant and a knowing smile. "Is it that obvious?" he asked, setting down his untouched champagne. Only to another reluctant participant in the wedding industrial complex. She extended her hand. "Faith Vasquez. I'm friends with the bride's sister." Her handshake was firm, confident. "Wyatt Williamson, cousin of the groom." "Ah, the mysterious tech genius cousin. I've heard about you." Her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled. "Emily mentioned you built some app that's worth millions." Wyatt felt a familiar tension in his shoulders. This was usually where conversations took a predictable turn, subtle inquiries about his net worth, thinly veiled investment pitches, or simply the shift in demeanor once people realized who he was. But Faith just laughed. "Don't worry. I'm not going to ask for stock tips or funding for my non-existent startup. I'm a kindergarten teacher. The only apps I'm interested in are the ones that keep 25-year-olds occupied during quiet time." Something in his expression must have betrayed his surprise because she added, "Disappointed I'm not a fellow tech mogul or social climber?" "Relieved, actually," Wyatt admitted, "though I'm curious what a kindergarten teacher is doing at this." He gestured vaguely at the excessive display of wealth around them. "The bride's sister and I were roommates in college. We've stayed close." Faith glanced around. "Though I admit I feel a bit like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture tonight. The woman at my table asked where I summered, as if that's a normal verb." Wyatt couldn't help but laugh. "And what did you tell her?" "That I summer in my apartment with a broken air conditioner and a popsicle addiction." For the first time that evening, Wyatt's smile was genuine. There was something refreshingly direct about Faith that made the stuffiness of the event recede into the background. "Would you like to get some air?" he asked impulsively. "The gardens here are supposed to be impressive." Faith tilted her head, considering him. "Is this your subtle way of escaping small talk with distant relatives?" "Absolutely, but the company is a definite bonus." The night air was cool against Wyatt's face as they stepped onto the terrace. Fairy lights twinkled in the manicured hedges of the hotel's garden, casting a soft glow that made the setting feel almost magical. For someone who prided himself on logic and practicality, Wyatt was surprised to find himself noticing such details. "So," Faith said as they walked along a stone path, "tell me something real about Wyatt Williamson. Not the millionaire app developer everyone's whispering about, but the actual person." The request caught him off guard. Most people were content with the surface-level details of his success. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. What makes you happy? What keeps you up at night? What did you want to be before you became what you are now?" Wyatt considered this as they paused beside a small fountain. "I wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid. Spent hours studying stars, building model rockets." "What happened to that dream?" "Life, I guess. I discovered I was better at writing code than passing NASA's physical requirements." He shrugged. "What about you?" "Always wanted to wrangle kindergartners?" Faith leaned against the fountain's edge. "Actually, yes, my mother was a teacher. I used to help her set up her classroom every August. There's something about watching a child figure something out for the first time. Their whole face lights up with this pure joy that adults rarely experience." The sincerity in her voice was captivating. Wyatt realized he'd grown accustomed to the calculated conversations of his business world, where every word seemed to have an agenda. "You must be good at it," he said. "I am," she replied without false modesty, "though the pay is abysmal, and I have to buy most of my own supplies, but the hugs make up for it." "The hugs?" "Kindergartners give the best hugs, completely wholehearted, no reservations." She smiled, then added, "something adults could learn from." Wyatt found himself wondering when he'd last experienced anything wholehearted. His success had brought wealth and recognition, but it had also surrounded him with people who wanted something from him, investors, partners, even friends who saw him as a connection rather than a person. "I should probably head back inside," Faith said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "My friend will wonder where I disappeared to." "Of course." Wyatt felt an unexpected reluctance to end their conversation. "It was nice meeting you, Faith." She turned to go, then paused. "You know, for someone everyone describes as intimidating and unapproachable, you're surprisingly easy to talk to." "Is that how Mark described me?" "His exact words were, 'brilliant, but thinks small talk is a form of torture.'" Her eyes danced with amusement. "He wasn't wrong, was he?" Wyatt laughed. "Not entirely, but some conversations are worth having." Faith reached into the small purse she carried and pulled out her phone. "Maybe we could have another one sometime." It was so straightforward, so refreshingly direct, that Wyatt found himself entering his number into her phone without the usual hesitation that accompanied such exchanges. There was something about Faith Vasquez that made him curious, a quality he'd built his career on but had somehow lost in his personal life. As they walked back toward the reception, Wyatt realized the evening had shifted from an obligation to an unexpected opportunity. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't thinking about work, investments, or the next big technological development. Instead, he was simply present, aware of the warm summer air, the distant melody of the string quartet, and the intriguing woman walking beside him. Little did he know that this chance meeting at his cousin's wedding would change everything. The Monday after the wedding, Wyatt found himself distracted during a crucial investor meeting. His chief financial officer was presenting projected earnings for the quarter, but Wyatt's thoughts kept drifting to his conversation with Faith in the garden. He'd expected her to text or call, wasn't that how these things usually worked, but his phone had remained silent throughout the weekend. "Wyatt, your thoughts on the expansion timeline?" His CFO's voice pulled him back to the present. "Sorry, I was considering the risks," a convenient excuse he often used when caught not paying attention. "Let's push forward with Phase 1, but keep Phase 2 contingent on the initial results." The meeting concluded, and Wyatt retreated to his office, a minimalist space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. He'd built Williams Tech from a dorm room project to a company valued at over $300 million in just 8 years. His app, Secure Sync, had revolutionized how businesses handled secure communications, earning him features in Forbes and Fortune before he'd turned 30. Yet, sitting at his desk, all he could think about was why a kindergarten teacher he'd met at a wedding hadn't contacted him. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, turning his attention to the stack of reports waiting for his review. He was acting like a teenager, not the CEO of a major tech company. His phone buzzed with a text notification. Wyatt ignored it, determined to focus on work, but curiosity got the better of him after a few minutes. It was from an unknown number. "Hi, Wyatt, it's Faith from the wedding. Sorry for the delay, spilled coffee on my phone and had to get it replaced. Would you like to grab coffee sometime? Promise not to spill it." Wyatt found himself smiling at the message, direct and unpretentious just like her. He considered his response carefully before typing. "Coffee sounds great. When works for you?" Her reply came quickly. "Teacher hours after 4 on weekdays or any time this weekend?" He checked his calendar. He had a dinner with potential investors on Friday, but Thursday was relatively clear. "Thursday 5 p.m., there's a good place called Elmwood Coffee near downtown." "Perfect. See you then." Wyatt set down his phone, surprised at the anticipation he felt for a simple coffee date. It had been a long time since he'd met someone outside his professional circles, someone who didn't seem impressed or intimidated by his success. Faith had treated him like a regular person, and that novelty alone was worth exploring. The rest of the week passed in a blur of meetings and development deadlines. By Thursday afternoon, Wyatt had almost convinced himself to cancel. What did he really have in common with a kindergarten teacher? Their worlds were completely different. Yet something kept him from sending that cancellation text, perhaps the memory of how easily conversation had flowed between them, or the refreshing honesty in her eyes. Elmwood Coffee was a small, independent shop he'd invested in a few years back, drawn to the owner's passion and the quality of their single-origin beans. Unlike the sterile corporate coffee chains that dominated the city, Elmwood felt warm and lived in, with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Wyatt arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a quiet corner table. He'd changed from his usual business attire into dark jeans and a gray sweater still put together, but less formal. He realized he wanted Faith to see him, not the CEO persona he typically presented to the world. At exactly 5 o'clock, the door opened and Faith walked in. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and she wore a simple blue blouse with jeans. She carried a worn leather messenger bag over her shoulder, and there was a smudge of what looked like green paint on her wrist. She spotted him immediately and waved, her smile genuine and warm. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," she said as she slid into the seat across from him. "Why wouldn't I?" "Oh, I don't know. Rich tech guy, busy schedule, probably gets asked out all the time." She shrugged. "Plus, I Googled you after the wedding. Your company's a bigger deal than you let on." Wyatt felt a familiar wariness creep in. "And what did your research tell you?" "That you're either terrible at bragging or refreshingly modest." Faith set her bag down. "Also that you turned down an acquisition offer from Google last year that would have made you a billionaire instead of just a multimillionaire, which I find intriguing." Before Wyatt could respond, a barista approached their table. "The usual, Mr. Williamson?" "Thanks, Jake, and whatever my friend would like." Faith ordered a chai latte, and when Jake left, she leaned forward. "You're a regular here?" "I invested in the place a few years ago. The owner, Jake's dad, has an incredible passion for coffee. Reminded me of my own obsession with coding when I was starting out." "That's nice," Faith said, seeming genuinely pleased. "Supporting small businesses instead of just parking your money in stocks or whatever rich people do." "You have some interesting assumptions about rich people," Wyatt noted, though his tone remained light. "Fair point. I shouldn't generalize." She took off her cardigan and hung it over the chair, revealing the full extent of the green paint not just on her wrist, but splattered up her forearm. "Hazard of the job," she explained, catching his gaze. "We were painting with our fingers today. The theme was jungle animals. I was helping with the crocodiles." There was something endearing about the way she wore the evidence of her day's work without embarrassment. In Wyatt's world, appearances were carefully managed. Vulnerability and imperfection were hidden behind polished presentations and calculated public images. "So," Faith continued after their drinks arrived, "why did you turn down Google? That seems like the dream for most startups." Wyatt considered his answer. Most people asked this question expecting some brilliant strategic explanation, but the truth was more personal. "I built Secure Sync because I saw how vulnerable people's private communications were. The big tech companies talk about security, but their business models are built on accessing user data. I didn't want my creation to become just another tool for harvesting information." Faith nodded thoughtfully. "So principles over profit, that's rare." "It wasn't entirely altruistic. I still believed we could grow more valuable independently. But yes, maintaining our core mission mattered to me." "What is that mission exactly? In kindergarten terms, please." She smiled over the rim of her mug. Wyatt found himself warming to her genuine interest. "We help people keep their secrets safe, like when you pass notes in class and don't want the teacher to read them, but on a much bigger scale. Now that I understand, kindergartners are constantly trying to pass secret notes that are usually just scribbles." They fell into an easy conversation after that. Faith told him about her classroom of 22 5-year-olds, each with their own distinct personality. She spoke about them with such affection and insight that Wyatt could almost picture each child from shy Emma, who whispered even when answering questions to boisterous Tyler, who considered himself the unofficial classroom announcer. In turn, Wyatt shared stories about the early days of his company sleeping under his desk to meet deadlines and surviving on ramen noodles despite having money in the bank because he forgot to eat proper meals when he was coding. "That explains why you're so thin," Faith remarked. "Don't they say millionaires should be at least a little pudgy from all those expensive business dinners?" "Another rich person stereotype," Wyatt said, finding her teasing oddly enjoyable. "Though not entirely wrong. I'm probably the only CEO whose assistant has remind Wyatt to eat lunch as a recurring calendar item." 2 hours passed without either of them noticing. The coffee shop had nearly emptied when Jake apologetically informed them they were closing soon. "I had no idea it was so late," Faith said, checking her watch. "I still have to prepare for tomorrow. We're learning about the letter P, which means I need to cut out about 100 paper penguins tonight." "Can I walk you to your car?" Wyatt offered as they gathered their things. "I took the bus, actually. Teacher's salary, remember?" There was no self-pity in her voice, just matter-of-fact acceptance. "Let me drive you home then," he said, then quickly added, "No pressure, though. I understand if that seems too forward." Faith studied him for a moment. "I'd like that. But fair warning, I live in a very non-millionaire neighborhood." Wyatt's car was parked a block away, a Tesla Model S that he'd purchased more for its environmental credentials than its status symbol qualities, though he had to admit he enjoyed its performance. "Of course you drive a Tesla," Faith said when they reached it, very on brand for a tech CEO. "Would you prefer I drove a gas-guzzling luxury car?" he asked, holding the passenger door for her. "No, but maybe a Tesla with a bumper sticker or some personality." She settled into the seat. "This is like sitting inside a spaceship." As Faith gave him directions to her apartment in the Greenwood neighborhood, Wyatt realized how rarely he ventured into the more residential parts of Seattle. His life revolved around downtown, his luxury condo, the office, and the handful of upscale restaurants where he conducted business meals. Faith's building was a modest mid-century apartment complex with window boxes full of flowers and bicycles chained to the railings. It was well maintained, but worlds away from the sleek high-rise where he lived. "This is me," she said as he pulled up to the curb. "Thanks for the ride, and the coffee." "I had a really nice time." "So did I," Wyatt replied, surprised by how true it was. Their conversation had been the most genuine interaction he'd had in months, maybe years. "Could we do this again sometime?" Faith smiled, the streetlight illuminating the warm copper highlights in her hair. "I'd like that. Maybe you can even upgrade from coffee to dinner." "Dinner sounds perfect." He found himself returning her smile easily. She gathered her bag and opened the car door, then paused. "You know, for a millionaire tech genius, you're surprisingly normal, Wyatt Williamson. And for a kindergarten teacher, you're surprisingly insightful, Faith Vasquez." After she disappeared into her building, Wyatt sat in his car for a moment, realizing that for the first time in ages, he'd spent an entire evening without once checking his phone for emails or messages. He'd been completely present, engaged in conversation with someone who seemed to see past his success to the person underneath. As he drove back to his downtown condo, Wyatt wondered if Faith had any idea how rare that was in his world, or how much he was already looking forward to seeing her again. Their second date was dinner at a small Italian restaurant Wyatt had never heard of, before Faith suggested it. Tucked away on a side street in Ballard, Bella Knott was family-owned, with checkered tablecloths and candles and empty wine bottles. The owner greeted Faith by name and led them to a corner table, chattering in rapid Italian interspersed with English. "You must come here often," Wyatt observed after they were seated. "My apartment is 2 blocks from here, and I can't cook to save my life," Faith admitted. "Marco and his wife basically keep me from starvation. Their son Gio was in my class 3 years ago." "The food must be good then." "It's amazing, but more importantly, it's real. No foam or deconstruction or whatever they're doing at those fancy places downtown." She handed him a menu. "The lasagna will change your life." Wyatt couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten at a restaurant that wasn't chosen for its business, meeting appropriateness or Michelin stars. The menu was handwritten, the prices reasonable, and when their food arrived, the portions were generous and unpretentiously delicious. "You were right about the lasagna," he said after his first bite. Faith looked pleased. "Told you. Now, tell me something I don't know about you." "That's a broad request." "Okay, something specific then. What's something you love that most people wouldn't guess?" Wyatt considered this. "I collect vintage arcade games. I have about 15 in my condo." Faith's eyes widened with genuine delight. "Really? Like Pac-Man and Space Invaders?" "Exactly. I spent a lot of time in arcades as a kid. I was socially awkward, and video games made sense to me when people didn't." He surprised himself with the admission. "What about you? Any unexpected passions?" "I build elaborate dollhouses," Faith said. "Started when I was 8 and never stopped. I have a whole miniature neighborhood in my spare room. Most are for display, but I let my students help design one each year for our classroom." "That sounds incredible," Wyatt said, genuinely intrigued. "I'd love to see them sometime." The conversation flowed easily from there. Wyatt found himself sharing stories he rarely told anyone about growing up as the awkward math prodigy with more interest in computers than sports, about his parents who still lived in the same modest house in Tacoma despite his offers to buy them something grander, about the insecurities that still plagued him despite his success. In return, Faith told him about growing up as the daughter of a single mother who taught elementary school, about putting herself through college with scholarships and part-time jobs, about the rewards and challenges of teaching in an underfunded public school system. "The thing is," she said as they shared a tiramisu, "I could probably get a job at one of those fancy private schools where the classrooms have everything you could dream of, but the kids who really need dedicated teachers are in the public system." "That's admirable," Wyatt said sincerely. Faith shrugged. "It's not admirable. It's just what makes sense to me. We all have to decide what matters, right?" After dinner, they walked through the neighborhood. The cool evening air filled with the scent of salt from the nearby sound. Their hands brushed once, twice, and then Wyatt gently took hers. Faith's fingers intertwined with his without hesitation. "This is nice," she said softly. "Simple." Simple wasn't a word often associated with Wyatt's life, but he had to agree. There was something wonderfully uncomplicated about walking hand in hand on a quiet street with someone who made him laugh, who listened when he spoke, who seemed interested in him rather than what he could provide. When they reached Faith's apartment building, neither seemed eager to end the evening. "Would you like to come up? See the dollhouse village?" Faith offered. "I promise it's not a line. I really do have miniature houses and they're really cool." Wyatt smiled. "I'd love to." Faith's apartment was small but warmly decorated, with bookshelves lining one wall and colorful artwork, some professional, some clearly created by her students on the others. A worn but comfortable-looking couch faced a modest television, and plants occupied every available windowsill. "It's not much compared to what you're used to," Faith said, a hint of self-consciousness in her voice for the first time. "It's perfect," Wyatt replied honestly. "It feels like a home." She led him to the second bedroom, which had been converted into what she called her miniature workshop. The room was lined with shelves displaying the most intricate dollhouses Wyatt had ever seen. Each was different: a Victorian mansion with tiny gingerbread trim, a modern tiny house with working solar panels, a replica of what Faith explained was her childhood home. "These are amazing," Wyatt said, bending to examine the incredible detail in a 1950s diner, complete with miniature milkshakes on the counter. "You made all of these?" "Over many years, yes. It's my meditation, I guess. When the real world gets overwhelming, I can control everything in the miniature one." Wyatt understood that sentiment perfectly. "I feel the same way about coding. It's a world where everything follows logical rules." Faith smiled. "We're not so different then." Their eyes met, and Wyatt felt a surge of attraction that went beyond the physical. Faith was beautiful, certainly, but it was her authenticity, her passion for her work and hobbies, her unguarded way of moving through the world that truly drew him to her. When he kissed her, it wasn't calculated or planned. It simply felt like the natural progression of the connection building between them. Her lips were soft against his, her hand gentle as it rested against his chest. The kiss deepened, but Faith eventually pulled back slightly. "I should probably mention that I don't usually kiss on second dates," she said, a little breathless. "Should I apologize?" Wyatt asked, his hand still resting at her waist. "Definitely not. I'm just saying this is an exception to my rule." She smiled up at him. "You're an exception to a lot of my rules, apparently." "Such as?" "Such as, never date someone who could buy and sell your apartment building without noticing the expense." Wyatt laughed softly. "Is my net worth going to be an issue for you?" Faith considered this seriously. "Not if your character matches the glimpses I've seen so far. Money doesn't impress me, Wyatt. But kindness, honesty, passion for what you do, those things do." Her directness was both refreshing and challenging. In his world of careful corporate speak and strategic relationships, few people spoke their minds so clearly. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "Maybe show you my world a bit, since you've shown me yours." "I'd like that. Though I should warn you that I don't own anything fancy enough for whatever billionaire hangouts you frequent." "Millionaire," he corrected with a smile. "And I was thinking more along the lines of showing you my arcade collection and maybe cooking dinner. I make an excellent pasta carbonara." Faith's expression softened. "That sounds perfect." Wyatt left Faith's apartment that night with plans to see her again the following weekend, and a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his thoughts weren't consumed by work or the responsibilities of running his company. Instead, he found himself replaying their conversations, the feel of her hand in his, the soft press of her lips. It was a novel sensation, this simple happiness, unconnected to achievement or acquisition. As he drove back to his condo, Wyatt wondered if this was what had been missing from his carefully constructed life all along. The weeks seemed to crawl by as Wyatt anticipated seeing Faith again. They texted daily quick messages about their days, funny observations, getting to know each other in the small moments between their responsibilities. Faith sent him pictures of her students' art projects and amusing anecdotes from her classroom. Wyatt shared the frustrations of dealing with investors and the satisfaction of solving complex coding problems. By Friday, when he was set to host Faith at his condo, Wyatt felt both excited and strangely nervous. His home reflected his success, a penthouse with panoramic views of Elliott Bay, minimalist furniture chosen by an interior designer, and state-of-the-art technology throughout. But now he worried it might seem cold or impersonal to someone like Faith, whose modest apartment radiated warmth and personality. He spent the afternoon preparing, stopping at Pike Place Market for fresh ingredients, and arranging his collection of arcade games to showcase some of the more interesting pieces. He even put fresh flowers on the dining table, something he'd never bothered with before, even when hosting business associates for dinner. Faith arrived precisely at 7, wearing jeans and a soft green sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She carried a small gift bag and a bottle of wine. "Wow," she said as she stepped into the foyer, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the sweeping view of the Sound. "This is," she trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. "Too much?" Wyatt asked, suddenly self-conscious. Faith turned to him with a smile. "I was going to say exactly what I expected, actually. Very elegant, impressive, maybe a little intimidating at first glance." She handed him the wine and the gift bag. "Nothing fancy. Teacher budget, remember?" Inside the bag, Wyatt found a small, beautifully crafted miniature arcade game, perfectly detailed right down to the tiny joystick. "You made this?" he asked, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I did. It's Galaga. You mentioned it was your favorite." "This is amazing, Faith." "Thank you." He carefully set the miniature on a shelf where it would be displayed prominently. "Would you like the grand tour before dinner?" The tour quickly turned into Faith, challenging him to games on several of his vintage arcades, her competitive spirit emerging as she trash-talked him through rounds of Donkey Kong and Ms. Pac-Man. Her delight in the games was infectious, and Wyatt found himself laughing more than he had in months. "I can't believe you have the original Street Fighter cabinet," Faith said, running her hand over the control panel. My mom used to let me play this at the laundromat when I was a kid. It was my first major purchase after Secure Sync took off, Wyatt admitted. Probably should have bought something practical, but this felt like a tangible symbol of success to my former arcade rat self. Faith's expression softened. I love that you honor that part of yourself. Too many people try to erase where they came from when they achieve success. In the kitchen, Faith insisted on helping as Wyatt prepared dinner, despite his protests that she was his guest. They worked side by side, chopping vegetables and stirring sauce, the conversation flowing easily between them. When their hands occasionally brushed, Wyatt felt an electric awareness that intensified throughout the evening. Over dinner, Faith asked thoughtful questions about his work, showing genuine interest in understanding what drove him. In turn, he found himself increasingly fascinated by her insights into education and child development. The thing most people don't understand about 5-year-olds, Faith explained as they shared tiramisu, Wyatt had picked up from a local Italian bakery, is that they're complete humans with complex inner lives. They're just missing the vocabulary and experience to express everything they feel. Sounds like some adults I know, Wyatt commented. Faith laughed. Exactly. The difference is that kindergartners are still learning and growing every day. Some adults get stuck. Do you think I'm stuck? The question slipped out before Wyatt could consider it more vulnerable than he'd intended. Faith studied him thoughtfully. I think you've mastered one area of your life so completely that maybe other areas haven't had room to develop at the same pace. But no, I don't think you're stuck. You're here, aren't you? Trying something new? The perceptiveness of her observation struck Wyatt. Faith seemed to see aspects of himself he'd never fully articulated, even in his own thoughts. After dinner, they moved to the balcony with glasses of wine, looking out at the lights of the city and the dark expanse of water beyond. The night air was cool but not uncomfortable, and Faith stood close to him at the railing. Thank you for tonight, she said quietly, for letting me see this part of your world. Thank you for being interested in it, Wyatt replied. Most people just see the surface, the money, the success. They don't care about the person behind it. Faith turned to face him, her expression serious in the dim light. I care about the person. The success is just a footnote. Wyatt kissed her then, drawn by the sincerity in her voice and the warmth in her eyes. Unlike their first kiss, which had been gentle and exploratory, this one deepened quickly, revealing a mutual desire that had been building throughout the evening. Faith's hands slid up his chest to his shoulders as his arms encircled her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss felt both exciting and somehow familiar, as if they'd known each other much longer than the few weeks since Mark's wedding. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Faith looked up at him with a mix of desire and hesitation. I should probably go, she said softly, though she made no move to step away from him. You could stay, Wyatt suggested, then quickly added, no pressure, though. We can take this as slow as you want. Faith considered this, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on his chest. Slow is good, but maybe not too slow, she smiled up at him. I'd like to stay. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. As they learned each other's bodies with the same curiosity and attention they'd given to learning each other's minds, Wyatt felt a connection forming that went beyond physical attraction or intellectual compatibility. There was something about Faith, her openness, her honesty, her way of living fully in each moment that resonated with a part of himself he had neglected for too long. Later, as Faith slept beside him in his king-sized bed that had never before felt so much like it belonged to a home rather than a showcase, Wyatt realized with startling clarity that he was falling for her. The thought should have terrified him. He'd kept relationships casual for years, focusing on his company's growth instead of his personal life. But as he watched Faith's peaceful expression in the soft light filtering through his windows, all he felt was a profound sense that something important had just begun. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Wyatt with its ease. Despite their different schedules and worlds, he and Faith found ways to weave their lives together. Weeknight dinners at her apartment, where they cooked simple meals and Faith graded papers while he answered emails. Weekend mornings at his condo, lingering over coffee with the panoramic view of the city spread before them. Faith introduced him to her favorite local haunts, a used bookstore where the owner kept cat treats for the neighborhood strays, a hole-in-the-wall Ethiopian restaurant with the best injera bread in Seattle, a community garden where she volunteered once a month. In turn, Wyatt shared parts of his world, a private tour of the Museum of Pop Culture from the director, who owed him a favor, dinner at the exclusive members-only club atop the Columbia Center, a weekend sailing trip on a friend's yacht. "This is completely ridiculous," Faith laughed as they lounged on the deck of the yacht, the San Juan Islands creating a picturesque backdrop. "I feel like I'm in a movie about how the other half lives." "Too much?" Wyatt asked, a hint of anxiety in his voice. He'd been careful not to overwhelm her with displays of wealth, but sometimes the disparity in their lifestyles became unavoidably apparent. Faith shook her head, taking his hand. "Not too much, just different from my normal weekend of laundry and lesson planning." She kissed him lightly. "I'm enjoying the contrast. And the company. Of course." What struck Wyatt most was how Faith moved between these different worlds with the same authentic presence. She was as comfortable chatting with the yacht owner's wife about their charity foundation as she was discussing urban gardening techniques with the volunteers at her community garden. She never seemed intimidated by wealth or status, nor did she affect false sophistication. Faith was simply herself in every context, a quality Wyatt found increasingly rare and valuable. One rainy Tuesday evening in October, about 2 months after they'd begun dating, Wyatt arrived at Faith's apartment with takeout from her favorite Thai restaurant. He used the key she'd given him the previous week, a small gesture that had felt surprisingly significant to them both. "Fair warning," Faith called from the bathroom where she was washing finger paint from her arms. "I had the day from hell. Tyler decided to use scissors on Maddie's braid, the hamster escaped during science time, and the principal observed my math lesson right when half the class decided to stage a protest over the cafeteria's decision to remove chocolate milk from the lunch options." Wyatt laughed, setting out the containers of food on her small dining table. "Sounds like you need wine more than pad thai." "Both, definitely both." Faith emerged from the bathroom, her hair damp at the edges and her face free of makeup. She wore sweatpants and one of Wyatt's t-shirts that she'd claimed during a weekend stay at his place. Even exhausted and dressed down, she was beautiful to him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest with a tired sigh. "How was your day, Mr. Millionaire? Any hostile takeovers or software emergencies?" "Nothing so dramatic. Though we did have an interesting meeting with some Japanese investors who might help us expand into Asian markets." He kissed the top of her head. "I missed you, though." "You saw me yesterday," Faith pointed out, though she tightened her arms around him. "Still missed you." They ate dinner curled up on her couch, Faith recounting the day's classroom adventures in more detail while Wyatt shared news about his company's potential expansion. It struck him how comfortable this had become, this sharing of their separate worlds, this genuine interest in the details of each other's days. "My cousin Mark called today," Wyatt mentioned as they finished their meal. "He and Emily want to have us over for dinner next weekend. Apparently Emily's been dying to hear how things are going with us." Faith smiled. "The matchmakers want a progress report?" "Something like that. Though Mark insists he had no idea we'd hit it off when he seated us at the same table at the wedding." "Liar. Emily told me he specifically mentioned his brilliant but socially awkward cousin who might need rescuing from small talk." Faith's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Though, in fairness, she also warned me you were probably too focused on your company to be interested in dating anyone." Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "And yet you gave me your number anyway." "What can I say? I have a weakness for brilliant, socially awkward men." She leaned over to kiss him softly. "Especially ones who look at me the way you did that night in the garden." "How did I look at you?" "Like you were seeing something unexpected and intriguing. Like you wanted to figure me out." She traced his jawline with her finger. No one had ever looked at me quite like that before. Wyatt caught her hand and kissed her palm. I'm still figuring you out. Still intrigued. Later, as they lay in Faith's bed, the sound of rain against the windows creating a soothing backdrop, Wyatt found himself contemplating how quickly and completely Faith had become essential to his life. Before her, he'd measured his days by professional achievements, deals closed, problems solved, milestones reached. Now he found himself equally invested in the small moments they shared, inside jokes, quiet evenings, the way she always reached for his hand when they walked together. "What are you thinking about?" Faith asked sleepily, noticing his thoughtful expression. Wyatt hesitated, then decided on honesty. "That I love you." Faith's eyes opened fully, sleep forgotten. She pushed herself up on one elbow to look at him. "That's a big thought." "It is," he agreed, suddenly nervous about her reaction. "Too big?" Her face softened into a smile. "No, just right, actually." She leaned down to kiss him gently. "I love you too, Wyatt. Have for a while now." The simple exchange of those words felt monumental, another shift in a relationship that had already changed so much about how Wyatt viewed his life and priorities. As Faith settled back against his chest, her breathing gradually slowing as she drifted toward sleep, Wyatt realized that for the first time in years, his vision of the future included more than just professional success. It now held the promise of shared mornings and evenings, of building something lasting with this woman who had walked so unexpectedly into his life at his cousin's wedding. The following Saturday, Wyatt and Faith arrived at Mark and Emily's suburban home for dinner. It was the first time they'd socialized as a couple with the people responsible for their meeting, and there was a celebratory air to the evening. "I knew it," Emily exclaimed after hugging them both. "The minute I saw you two talking at the wedding, I told Mark you had chemistry." "She wouldn't stop talking about it," Mark confirmed, leading them into the living room where wine and appetizers waited. "Though I have to admit I was skeptical. Wyatt hasn't exactly prioritized dating in recent years." Wyatt felt Faith squeeze his hand supportively. "Work kept me busy," he said simply. "Too busy," Mark teased. "Remember when you missed my 30th birthday because you were launching that security update?" "In my defense, it was a critical update," Wyatt protested, though he felt a twinge of guilt at the reminder of how often he'd put work before personal connections. Faith smoothly changed the subject, asking Emily about their honeymoon in Greece, and the conversation shifted to travel stories and wedding memories. Throughout dinner, Wyatt noticed how effortlessly Faith interacted with his cousin and new cousin-in-law, drawing them out with questions and sharing amusing stories about her kindergarten class. "She's amazing," Mark said quietly to Wyatt when the women stepped outside to see Emily's new garden. "Completely different from anyone you've dated before." "I know," Wyatt agreed, watching through the window as Faith bent to examine a plant, listening intently to whatever Emily was explaining. "She's changed everything." Mark studied his cousin thoughtfully. "You seem different too, more present, less like your mind is constantly somewhere else solving technical problems." Wyatt couldn't deny it. Faith had helped him rediscover the value of being fully engaged in the moment, of connecting with people beyond transactional relationships. "She reminds me there's more to life than work." "About time someone did," Mark said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Mom's been saying for years that you needed balance." On the drive home, Faith was unusually quiet, looking out the window at the passing lights of the city. "Everything okay?" Wyatt asked, glancing over at her. She turned to him with a pensive expression. "Can I ask you something potentially awkward?" "Of course." "Mark mentioned your ex, Natalie. Said she worked at your company?" There was no accusation in Faith's tone, just curiosity. Wyatt hadn't expected this topic to arise. "She was our head of marketing for about a year. We dated briefly toward the end of her time with the company." "What happened?" He considered how to explain the relationship that had ended almost 2 years ago. "We worked well together professionally, but personally it was complicated. Natalie was very focused on projecting a certain image both for herself and for the company. Everything was about appearances, networking, being seen at the right events with the right people. "And that's not you," Faith observed. "Not really, though I played along for a while. Eventually, I realized she was more interested in dating the CEO of Williams Tech than in dating Wyatt Williamson. When I suggested we keep a lower profile, focus more on actual connection and less on attending galas and industry parties, things fell apart." Faith was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Did you love her?" The question was direct, as Faith's questions tended to be. Wyatt appreciated her straightforwardness, even when it ventured into difficult territory. "I thought I might, at one point. But looking back, I think I was just going through the motions of what a relationship was supposed to be. It never felt like this." He reached over to take her hand. "It was never real the way this is." Faith squeezed his hand but remained thoughtful. "I guess I'm trying to understand why you chose me. We're so different from the kind of woman I imagine a tech millionaire typically dates." Wyatt pulled into the parking garage of his building and turned to face her properly. "That's exactly why. You're real, Faith. You don't care about my net worth or my company's market position. You call me out when I check my email during dinner. You're passionate about your work, even though it doesn't make you rich or famous." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You see me, not what I represent. Do you know how rare that is in my world?" Faith's expression softened. "I do see you. The good parts and the workaholic parts and the parts that get awkward at parties." She leaned across the center console to kiss him softly. "That's why I love you." As November turned to December, the relationship continued to deepen. Wyatt found himself spending more nights at Faith's apartment than at his own condo, despite the considerable downgrade in space and amenities. There was something about her cozy space that felt more like home than his expensive penthouse ever had. Faith's influence began to show in other areas of his life as well. He started leaving the office by 6 most evenings, delegating more tasks to his capable management team. He joined Faith for community service events, helping at the food bank where she volunteered monthly and participating in a reading program at her school. The elementary school principal nearly fell over when she realized the casual guy in jeans reading "Where the Wild Things Are" to a group of enthralled kindergartners was the Wyatt Williamson, tech industry wunderkind. For Christmas, Wyatt suggested they take a trip together, perhaps somewhere tropical and luxurious. Faith countered with a different proposal. "What if we spend the first part of the break with your parents in Tacoma, then visit my mom in Portland? Do a real family Christmas instead of a resort?" she suggested one evening as they decorated her small artificial tree with a mismatched collection of ornaments. The idea both touched and terrified Wyatt. He hadn't brought anyone home for the holidays since college. "You want to meet my parents?" "Of course I do. You've told me so much about them. Besides, we've been together for 4 months now. Isn't that the normal progression? Meet the family, evaluate potential in-laws?" She said it lightly, but there was a question in her eyes. Wyatt set down the ornament he was holding and pulled her into his arms. "You're right. It's time. Fair warning, though my mother will show you embarrassing childhood photos and ask invasive questions about our future plans." Faith laughed. "Perfect. I'll bring my best kindergarten teacher interrogation skills to compare notes with her." The holiday visit proved to be a revelation for Wyatt. Watching Faith charm his parents in their modest Tacoma home, helping his father string lights on the front porch while discussing baseball statistics, learning his mother's secret recipe for gingerbread cookies. It all felt so natural, as if Faith had always been part of his family. His parents, who had always been supportive but somewhat mystified by his tech career and wealth, clearly adored Faith. She bridged the worlds effortlessly, drawing out stories of Wyatt's childhood and sharing her own experiences growing up with a teacher mother. "She's wonderful, honey," his mother said when they had a moment alone in the kitchen. "The way she looks at you, that's the real thing." "I know," Wyatt replied, watching through the doorway as Faith and his father debated the merits of different board games for the evening's entertainment. "I'm going to ask her to marry me, Mom." His mother's eyes widened, then filled with tears. "When?" "New Year's Eve. I already have the ring." He'd purchased it the previous week, a vintage emerald surrounded by small diamonds. Not the massive solitaire that might have been expected from someone of his wealth, but a unique piece that reminded him of Faith's individuality and warmth. "She'll say yes," his mother said with certainty. "Anyone can see you two belong together." The visit to Faith's mother in Portland was equally successful, though different in nature. Susan Vasquez, a recently retired elementary school teacher, lived in a small craftsman house filled with books and folk art collected over decades of travel during summer breaks. She was a forthright, energetic woman who clearly had passed her direct communication style to her daughter. "So you're the millionaire who's been monopolizing my daughter's time," she said upon meeting Wyatt, though her eyes were kind and her handshake warm. "Mom," Faith protested. "What? It's not an accusation, just a fact." Susan turned back to Wyatt. "I hope you know how special she is." "I do," Wyatt assured her, "and I'm the lucky one in this relationship." Susan studied him thoughtfully, then nodded as if he'd passed some test. "Good answer. Now come help me with this tree while Faith makes the hot chocolate." By the end of their stay, Wyatt had won over Susan as thoroughly as Faith had charmed his parents. On their last night, as Faith showered before dinner, Susan took Wyatt aside. "Faith tells me you've made her happier than she's ever been," she said directly. "I can see it in her face. She glows around you." "She does the same for me," Wyatt replied honestly. "Your daughter has changed my life, Susan. She's helped me remember what really matters." Susan nodded approvingly. "That's her gift. She sees people, really sees them, always has, even as a child." She fixed him with a knowing look. "Just don't hurt her. Faith loves with her whole heart, no reservations." "I won't," Wyatt promised. "Actually, I'm planning to ask her to marry me on New Year's Eve." Susan's face broke into a wide smile. "Well, it's about time. I was beginning to think I'd have to drop hints." After the warmth of their family Christmas, returning to Seattle felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Though they hadn't officially discussed living together, Faith was spending almost every night at Wyatt's condo, and more of her things migrated there each week: books on his shelves, her favorite mug in his cabinet, a growing collection of plants brightening his once sterile space. For New Year's Eve, Wyatt had planned a private celebration at his condo, complete with champagne, Faith's favorite foods, and the spectacular view of the Space Needle fireworks at midnight. The ring was hidden in his desk drawer, and though he'd rehearsed what he wanted to say, he found himself growing increasingly nervous as the evening approached. His phone rang as he was setting up the dining table with the fine china he rarely used. It was his CFO, Lawrence. "Sorry to bother you on New Year's Eve," Lawrence began, "but we've got a situation with the Singapore deal. Their legal team is raising last-minute objections to the terms we negotiated. They're threatening to walk away if we don't address their concerns immediately." Wyatt frowned. The Singapore expansion was crucial to their growth strategy for the coming year. What exactly are their objections? As Lawrence detailed the complex legal and financial issues, Wyatt realized this wasn't something that could be resolved quickly or delegated easily. The Singaporean executives were in the office now, midday their time, and expected immediate attention to their concerns. "I need to handle this personally," Wyatt said finally. "Set up a video conference as soon as possible." When he hung up, Wyatt glanced at his watch. Faith would arrive in less than 2 hours, and there was no telling how long the negotiation would take. With a sinking feeling, he realized their perfect New Year's Eve and his proposal plans might be in jeopardy. He called Faith immediately, his heart heavy. "Hey, we might have a problem with tonight." Faith listened as he explained the situation, her disappointment evident, but her response measured. "It's okay, Wyatt. I understand this is important. I'll try to wrap it up before you arrive," he promised, "but these negotiations can be unpredictable." "Do what you need to do," Faith said. "I can always watch the fireworks from your balcony while you finish up." Her understanding should have reassured him, but instead, it heightened Wyatt's frustration with the situation. This was supposed to be a special night, the night he asked Faith to share her life with him, and now business was intruding yet again. By the time Faith arrived, looking beautiful in a simple black dress with her hair swept up, Wyatt was still on the video conference, negotiating terms with the Singapore team. He greeted her with an apologetic kiss before returning to his home office. where his laptop displayed the faces of executives halfway around the world. Faith settled on the couch with a glass of champagne and the book she'd brought, seemingly content to wait. Through the partially open office door, Wyatt could occasionally glimpse her patient, understanding, giving him the space to resolve the crisis even on this significant evening. The negotiation dragged on longer than expected, with complex legal language requiring careful review and multiple concessions being discussed. At 11:30 p.m., with just 30 minutes until midnight, Wyatt made an executive decision. "Gentlemen, I need to propose we continue this discussion tomorrow," he said firmly to the Singapore team. "It's New Year's Eve here in Seattle, and I have personal commitments I cannot postpone." There was visible surprise on the executives' faces. They knew Wyatt's reputation for prioritizing business above all else. But after a brief consultation among themselves, they agreed to resume the following day. Wyatt ended the call and rushed back to the living room, where Faith was curled up on the couch, still reading patiently. "I am so sorry," he said, sitting beside her and taking her hands. "That went much longer than I expected." Faith smiled, setting her book aside. "It's okay. Did you get everything resolved?" "No, but I told them it would have to wait until tomorrow." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Some things are more important." Faith's expression registered surprise. "You postponed a major business negotiation for New Year's Eve?" "Not just for New Year's Eve," Wyatt said, suddenly certain that this moment, imperfect as it was still the right one. "For us. For what I want to say to you tonight." He stood, pulling her to her feet, then reached into his pocket where he'd hurriedly transferred the ring box before joining her. "Wyatt," Faith breathed, her eyes widening as she realized what was happening. "Faith Vasquez, you walked into my life at my cousin's wedding and completely changed everything. You showed me what it means to live fully, to connect genuinely, to prioritize what truly matters." He dropped to one knee, opening the vintage ring box to reveal the emerald ring. "I love you more than I thought possible, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Faith's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course I will." As Wyatt slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, the first fireworks burst over the Space Needle, visible through the wall of windows. The timing couldn't have been more perfect if he'd planned it. Faith pulled him to his feet and into a deep kiss, both of them laughing and crying simultaneously. When they finally broke apart, she held up her hand, admiring the way the emerald caught the light. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Not what I expected from a tech millionaire, but perfect." "Just like you," Wyatt replied. "Unexpected, but perfect." They moved to the balcony to watch the remainder of the fireworks. Faith tucked against Wyatt's side as they sipped champagne and talked about their future together, where they would live, when they might get married, the life they wanted to build. "I think we should live here initially," Faith said, surprising him. "My apartment is too small for two people, and this place has the better view." She smiled up at him. "Though we might need to add some color and personality to your minimalist paradise." "Whatever you want," Wyatt agreed readily. "This place never felt like a home until you started spending time here anyway." As midnight passed and the fireworks faded from the sky, Wyatt reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful but isolated workaholic, measuring his worth by his company's achievements. Now, he stood with his fiancée beside him, finally understanding that success without someone to share it with was a hollow victory. "Penny for your thoughts," Faith said, noticing his contemplative expression. Wyatt smiled, pulling her closer. "I was just thinking about how differently this year is ending compared to how it began. How different I am." "Good different?" "The best different," he kissed her softly. "Thank you for saying yes." Faith laughed, her eyes sparkling in the city lights. "As if I could have said anything else. You're stuck with me now, Wyatt Williamson." "Promise?" he asked, surprising himself with the vulnerability in his voice. Faith's expression softened as she reached up to touch his face. "Promise. For better or worse, richer or poor, though in your case probably just richer." They both laughed, and as they returned inside from the cold night air, Wyatt felt a certainty he'd never experienced before. Faith was the unexpected gift he'd never known he needed until she appeared at his cousin's wedding and changed everything. Their engagement period was relatively short. Neither Wyatt nor Faith saw the need for a lengthy wait, and both preferred a smaller, more intimate celebration over an elaborate production. They chose a date in late May, just over a year after their first meeting at Mark and Emily's wedding. The months leading up to the wedding were busy with both professional and personal milestones. Wyatt successfully finalized the Singapore deal, though he made a point of maintaining more reasonable working hours and delegating responsibilities that previously would have consumed his evenings and weekends. Faith continued teaching, but began considering a position as a curriculum development specialist that would allow her to impact more students while giving her a more flexible schedule. They decided to purchase a new home together rather than simply having Faith move into Wyatt's condo. After looking at numerous properties, they found a craftsman-style house in a quiet neighborhood with a view of the Sound. It was smaller than what Wyatt could have afforded but felt right for their needs. 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen where they could cook together, a large yard for future possibilities neither discussed explicitly, but both considered. "Are you sure this is enough house for you?" Faith asked as they toured it for the second time. "Your condo was bigger than this." Wyatt wrapped his arms around her from behind as they stood in what would become their living room. "This isn't about square footage, it's about building a home together. I love that it needs some renovation. It gives us a chance to make it ours." The process of blending their lives wasn't without challenges. Faith's independent nature sometimes clashed with Wyatt's desire to provide everything for her. Their first significant disagreement came when Wyatt suggested paying off Faith's student loans as an engagement gift. "Absolutely not," Faith said firmly. "I've been managing those payments for years. I don't need you to swoop in and erase my debt." "But I want to," Wyatt argued. "It makes no sense for you to keep making payments when I could clear the balance with hardly a dent in my accounts." "It's not about what makes financial sense, Wyatt. It's about my independence, my responsibility for my own choices." Faith's expression softened as she saw his confusion. "I love that you want to take care of me, but I need to feel like an equal in this relationship, not a charity case." It took several conversations for Wyatt to fully understand Faith's perspective. His wealth had made certain problems disappear so easily for so long that he'd forgotten how financial struggles could be tied to a person's sense of autonomy and accomplishment. They eventually compromised. Faith would continue making her regular payments, but they would establish a joint account for household expenses to which they would both contribute proportionally based on their incomes. The solution respected Faith's need for independence while acknowledging the reality of their financial disparity. As their wedding day approached, Wyatt found himself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought them together. 1 year ago, he had attended his cousin's wedding out of family obligation, expecting nothing more than an evening of tedious small talk and superficial connections. Instead, he had met the woman who would become his wife, his partner, his anchor in a world that had previously felt like a perpetual race toward the next achievement. The wedding itself was held at a historic lodge overlooking Lake Washington. With just 70 guests, close family and friends, it felt intimate and personal. Faith wore a simple but elegant gown that made Wyatt's breath catch when he first saw her walking down the aisle on her mother's arm. Her smile as their eyes met conveyed everything words could not: joy, certainty, promise. Their vows, written by each of them separately, reflected the unique journey that had brought them together. Faith spoke of finding unexpected love with a man who had shown her that success and kindness could coexist, who supported her passion for teaching while introducing her to possibilities she'd never imagined for herself. Wyatt's vows, delivered with uncharacteristic emotion that brought tears to many eyes, thanked Faith for teaching him the true meaning of wealth, not measured in dollars or business accomplishments, but in moments of genuine connection and shared purpose. "Before you," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, I had everything society tells us we should want: success, recognition, financial security. But I was missing the most important thing: someone to share it all with, someone who sees past what I've achieved to who I truly am. You've given me that gift, Faith, and I promise to spend the rest of our lives trying to deserve it. The reception that followed was a joyful celebration that reflected their blended worlds. Mark gave a toast that had everyone laughing with stories of Wyatt's social awkwardness throughout their childhood and teenage years, concluding with sincere words about the transformation he'd witnessed in his cousin since meeting Faith. "I've known Wyatt my entire life," Mark said, raising his glass. "And I've never seen him as happy, as present, as complete as he is with you, Faith. You've accomplished what none of us could. You got him to look up from his computer and notice that life is happening all around him." Susan Vasquez's toast was equally moving, speaking of her daughter's compassionate heart and clear-eyed wisdom. "Faith has always seen the best in people," she said. "It's what makes her such a wonderful teacher. In Wyatt, she saw not just his success or intelligence, but his capacity for kindness and growth. I couldn't ask for a better partner for my daughter." As the evening progressed, Wyatt found a quiet moment with Faith on the venue's terrace, looking out at the moonlight reflecting on the lake. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. Faith leaned into him, her wedding ring catching the light as she placed her hand on his chest. "Completely. You?" "More than I knew was possible." He kissed her temple. "Where should we go from here, Mrs. Williamson?" Faith smiled at the new name. "Home, eventually. But first, I believe you promised me a honeymoon in Greece." 2 weeks on a private island, as requested," Wyatt confirmed. "Though I'm still surprised you chose that over that educational tour of historical sites you were considering." "We can do that next year," Faith said with the practical planning that was so characteristic of her. "This time, I want crystal clear water, beautiful sunsets, and absolutely no interruptions from the outside world." "No arguments here," Wyatt agreed, pulling her closer. "Though I should warn you, I did bring one work-related item with me." Faith pulled back to look at him with skeptical surprise. "You promised. No laptops, no conference calls from the beach." "It's not that kind of work," he assured her. "It's a proposal, a new kind of educational software that uses gaming principles to teach early reading skills. I thought you might want to collaborate on it, offer your expertise as a teacher." Faith's expression transformed from skepticism to intrigue. "You want my professional input? For a real product?" "Absolutely. Your knowledge of how children learn combined with our technical capabilities could create something really valuable for schools." He took her hands in his. "Only if you're interested, of course. And not during the actual honeymoon that's strictly for us." The joy in Faith's face told him he'd chosen the perfect wedding gift. Not an extravagant piece of jewelry or an expensive car, but recognition of her professional value and an opportunity to merge their separate worlds into a shared mission. "I love it," she said simply, "and I love you." As they rejoined their celebration, surrounded by the people who mattered most in their lives, Wyatt reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with a chance meeting at his cousin's wedding. He had never expected that the quiet, straightforward kindergarten teacher in the sage green dress would become the center of his world, teaching him that true wealth had little to do with financial success and everything to do with finding someone who saw him clearly and loved him completely. Faith had entered his life unexpectedly and changed everything: his priorities, his perspective, his understanding of what made a life well lived. As they danced together beneath strings of twinkling lights, Wyatt knew with absolute certainty that she was the one, the person he had been waiting for without even realizing he was waiting. 2 years later, on a warm summer evening, Wyatt arrived home from work earlier than usual. The educational software he and Faith had developed had become unexpectedly successful, adopted by school districts across the country and recently garnering interest internationally. Their collaboration had proven as effective professionally as it had personally, with Faith's practical teaching experience perfectly complementing Wyatt's technical expertise. He found Faith in the nursery they had finished preparing just weeks earlier, arranging books on a shelf beside the crib. At 7 months pregnant, she moved more carefully now, one hand often resting protectively on her rounded belly. She looked up with a smile when she heard him in the doorway. "You're home early," she said, crossing the room to kiss him. Meeting finished ahead of schedule. He placed his hand over hers on her stomach, feeling a solid kick in response. "How are my girls today?" "Active. Your daughter seems to have inherited your inability to sit still when there's work to be done." Faith leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. "We received another letter from that school in Boston. They really want us to consider bringing the program there for a pilot study." Wyatt nodded, though his focus was more on the moment at hand than future business prospects. Their home had become his sanctuary, the place where titles and net worth meant nothing compared to the family they were building together. "We can discuss that later," he said, guiding Faith to the comfortable rocking chair they'd placed by the window. "Sit. I brought dinner from that Italian place you've been craving." As they sat together, in what would soon be their daughter's room, eating takeout pasta and discussing names, they still hadn't settled on one, though both liked Emma and Lily, Wyatt felt a contentment that no business success had ever provided. Here, with Faith, he had found something his wealth could never have purchased: a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and a love that had grown steadily stronger since that first meeting in a wedding garden. "What are you thinking about?" Faith asked, noticing his contemplative expression, a question she'd asked countless times throughout their relationship. Wyatt smiled, taking her hand and kissing her palm in a gesture that had become familiar between them. "I'm thinking about how differently my life turned out than I expected. How much better." Faith returned his smile, her free hand resting on their growing daughter. "All because Mark seated us at the same table at his wedding." "I should probably thank him again," Wyatt mused. "We could name the baby after him," Faith suggested with a teasing smile. "Marcia has a nice ring to it." Wyatt laughed, shaking his head. "I think we can find a better way to show our gratitude." As the evening light softened around them, Wyatt reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this point. He had once defined himself by his professional achievements, measuring success in market share and millions of dollars. Now, sitting in a nursery with his pregnant wife, discussing baby names and school partnerships with equal interest, he understood that true wealth had nothing to do with financial statements. It was found in moments like these: quiet evenings at home, shared dreams for the future, the anticipation of their daughter's arrival. It was in the partnership he had built with a woman who had never been impressed by his bank account, but had always valued his heart and mind. Faith Vasquez Williamson, the kindergarten teacher who had become his wife, his business partner, the mother of his child, and the center of his world, had taught the millionaire the true meaning of wealth. And for that, Wyatt knew he would be forever grateful.